Sirens popped in Mason's ears as the earnings call went live. A red banner flashed across screens, and the room seemed to tilt. The SEC notice hit like cold iron and air left his chest. Mason Reed said, "Stay calm," but his voice shook. Dana Brooks whispered, "Mute the line," as keyboards rattled and camera lights burned white. Evelyn Cross stared at the floor, still unreadable. Stock ticks hammered the glass wall like rain. Mason feared one truth. Someone close had pulled a pin. Conrad Vale appeared on a studio feed, smiling like a knife. Mason needed the leaks stopped, the board steady, the brand breathing. He hunted for a clean thread in a knot of noise. A ledger note flickered on his tablet, a ghost line named Haven. Mason Reed said, "Who touched this file?" No one answered. The call timer blinked down, breaths counting with it. Evelyn lifted her eyes. The silence felt loaded, like the second before an alarm explodes. The call resumed, and air felt thin. Mason Reed said, "We will address the notice directly," while his pulse drummed in his ears. Dana slid a briefing across the table, pages warm from the printer. Numbers swam like fast water. The board pinged his phone with demands and timing. Evelyn watched him carefully, as if counting his breaths. The feed delay clipped his sentences into clean fragments. In the glass, he saw 3 versions of himself, none steady. Zoe pointed to a vendor pattern that didn't add up. Noah nodded too quickly, promising deeper logs. Mason Reed said, "Route audit to a secure channel." The ticker bled red, then deeper red. He needed one truth before open bell. Richard's hand rested on the chair back like a weight. Mason felt a draft from the hallway, cold and warning. If the leak was inside, who was steering the fall? Conrad's network interview rolled in the background like a drum line. He called for fresh leadership, and phones lit up across the floor. Mason Reed said, "He smells blood," and tried to slow his breathing. Dana whispered that 2 directors wanted a private huddle. The building hummed, vents whispering a steady hiss. Evelyn opened a folder and placed a single redacted contract in front of him. The ink bars looked like prison bars. Zoe traced shell names that tied to no real office. Noah offered access tokens that he claimed would speed the search. Richard studied the black lines, silent and heavy. Mason Reed said, "Who signed this?" A breeze lifted the document's corner. Outside, a siren softened into distance. Evelyn didn't blink. The signature waited under the blackout, a secret with sharp teeth. What would the missing lines reveal? The private huddle formed in a smaller glass room. The HVAC thrum felt louder, like a quiet threat. Mason Reed said, "We hold the line." Yet his hand tapped a staccato on the table. Dana listed risk paths, each one a bruise. Evelyn suggested a temporary trading halt if facts warranted it. The floor lights buzzed, a faint hive. Zoe pinged 3 anomalies in vendor flows within 1 hour. Noah proposed a mirror of core logs, claiming speed and clean access. Richard leaned back, eyes narrowed, hearing something unsaid. The city's gray bled into the carpet, flattening color. Mason Reed said, "We fix the truth before we fix the optics." The directors looked at their watches, time scraping forward. Somewhere, a copier jam clicked and reset. If the next file opened to a deeper cut, could the company survive the bleed? The room emptied to a hush that rang in Mason's head. He scrolled the audit trail, and the Haven tag surfaced again, brighter now. Mason Reed said, "Who created this partition?" His thumb hovered over confirm. The building creaked, old bones settling. Dana stepped back in, breath quick, saying 2 reporters had sources inside. Evelyn stood at the window, face unreadable in the faint reflection. Zoe messaged a cluster that mapped to a hidden treasury path. Noah sent a link with elevated rights, almost too fast. Richard's voice was a low bell, warning and patient. The cursor blinked like a metronome counting down a choice. Mason Reed said, "Open it." The screen asked for a second factor that only one person could supply. The phone buzzed on the table, caller ID dark. Would Evelyn unlock the door that changed everything? Elevators jammed and alarms barked in short bursts as the trading halt hit. Mason Reed said, "We move now," but fear tugged at his breath. Screens stuttered, light tearing across glass like lightning. Dana Brooks said, two reporters in the lobby, and her eyes scanned every badge. Evelyn Cross kept near the wall, steady, unreadable. Zoe Carter whispered that 3 vendor shells just sensed it once. Noah Grant said, "I can patch the gap, too fast, too eager." Richard Sterling stepped closer, voice a low bass under the sirens. Heat from the rack room rippled, and the floor hummed like a hive. Mason Reed said, "Route me raw logs, no filters." A ping popped on his tablet. A path marked Haven, lighting a corridor. The access time stamped a badge at 5:02 a.m. The name that flashed made the room lean. They took the stairwell and the noise fell to concrete silence. Mason Reed said, "I saw a 5:02 badge," and the words felt like frost. Dana sat on the step and rubbed her temples. Zoe exhaled slow, tracing the pattern on a folded chart with a thumb. Evelyn held the handrail, pulse visible at her throat. Noah Grant said, "If you trust me, I'll mirror the core," and his smile did not reach his eyes. Richard watched him like a locked door. A city siren sighed somewhere far below, softer now. Mason Reed said, "We use a clean room," and slid the tablet to airplane mode. A tiny brass icon of a key glinted on the Haven header, old and stubborn. Calm thinned the panic, and in that gap a thought took root. What if the key was not to break the wall, but to walk through it? Conrad Vale took the morning broadcast and turned it into a blade. He spoke in smooth lines about stewardship, and the market shifted like a school of fish. Mason Reed said, "He is setting the tide," tasting metal on his tongue. The studio's bright wash made Conrad look carved from glass. Dana muttered that 2 directors were wavering. Evelyn's phone lit with a blocked call and stayed face down. Noah Grant said, "We can answer with speed," and his fingers flexed. Richard counted seconds between Conrad's phrases, hearing the trap. Zoe lifted a chart where shell paths converged at one quiet node. Mason Reed said, "He wants us cornered before noon." The ticker bled again, ruthless and sure. If Conrad already owned the currents, who was feeding him the map? Richard led them to an old conference room that smelled of paper and rain. The lights were softer, and time slowed enough to think. Richard Sterling said, "I once hid a truth to save a company and lost the soul of it." Mason Reed felt the words hook behind his ribs. Evelyn Cross said, "Sometimes survival asks a price we never choose." Zoe placed the chart between them like a small fire. Dana breathed, and her voice shook less. Noah Grant said, "I can clean this in an hour," and Richard's eyes narrowed. The Haven key icon sat on the tablet, stubborn as a scar. Richard Sterling said, "Ask if the wall is a shield or a prison." The rain softened to a hush against the glass. The answer would cut either way. Which wound could the company live with? The decision rose like a tide and did not stop. Mason Reed said, "We open Haven under guard," and his voice steadied. Dana gathered names for a lockout team. Zoe mapped clean devices, sharp and fast. Noah Grant said, "I'll stage the mirror," but Mason's eyes held him in place. Evelyn Cross said, "You'll need my second factor." And the room tilted. Richard nodded once, as if a door had finally found its hinge. The building hum became a drumline, and footsteps answered in the hall. Mason Reed said, We moved to the secure lab and pocketed the tablet. The key icon glowed, small and fierce. Behind the lab door, new light waited. If the truth lived inside Haven, it would not stay quiet for long. The secure lab felt calm, like a chapel made of glass and code. Fans whispered, and the rain softened to a hush on the skylight. Mason Reed said, "No outside lines," and the door sealed with a click. Dana's shoulders lowered by a fraction. Zoe smiled, small and tired. A new visitor waited on the screen, invited for support. Lyle Harrow looked careful and kind, offering backup funding like bandages. Evelyn Cross said, "Short-term stability will quiet the board." Richard watched the pixels like they might bite. Lyle spoke of patience, of runway, of buying time. The words lay soft, like wool over a snare. Something in the silence felt miscounted. What cost hides inside a gentle offer? Time slowed to coffee and quiet keystrokes. Lyle Harrow said, "I can steady your cash burn while you clear the books," and the line purred. Evelyn Cross said, "Transparency first," and rubbed a thumb across the desk edge. Dana shared a memory of salvaging a broken quarter with grit and luck. Zoe laughed once, thin but real, and traced a clean path through the data. Mason Reed said, "If we hold together, we make it," and he meant it. Richard noted each pause, each glance, as if reading a weather map. Noah Grant said, "Mirror is ready," and looked down when no one answered. A tiny delay flicked across Lyle's feed, like a blink that hid a thought. Trust warmed the room, but warmth can hide a fuse. What promise just tied their hands? The door to the wider floor opened for a board call, and Conrad's voice entered like a cold wind. He spoke of duty, of confidence, of leadership measured in numbers. Mason Reed said, "You sell certainty and buy fear," and the line crackled. Conrad Vale said, "I buy outcomes," and let the words sit like a weight. The two men mapped different worlds on the same table. Dana glanced at the clock, counting the seconds of influence. Evelyn Cross said, "We have a corrective plan," and kept her tone even. Richard heard the hunger inside Conrad's careful phrasing. Zoe watched the ticker steady, then twitch again. Mason Reed said, "We'll file the truth," and felt the cost bite. If Conrad owned the room's air, what would it take to breathe? The redacted contract opened, and a signature surfaced like a knife from water. Evelyn Cross said, "That is my name," and the room tilted. Mason Reed felt the floor move under him. Noah Grant said, "Then the fix is simple," and slid a path to removal. Dana's breath caught hard. Richard stared at the line items and saw absence where context should be. Zoe traced dates that did not fit any real office. Conrad's counsel pinged in a second window, already armed. Mason Reed said, "Not one step until we see the whole ledger." A quiet hung, heavy and right. Security stepped in with a board directive. The vote to suspend came like a door slamming, whose hand had set the hinges. After the vote, silence pressed against the glass like deep water. Mason Reed said, "This is cut to fit someone else's frame," and the words tasted of rust. Dana steadied his jacket without a word. Zoe pushed a drive into his palm, tiny and bright. Richard said, "Truth does not vanish when light moves," and his voice held. Evelyn Cross met Mason's eyes, and a flicker passed like static. Noah Grant looked away, hands too still. The city hissed with wet tires, a slow chorus of distance. Mason Reed said, "If there is a door, we find it," and pocketed the drive. The hallway stretched ahead, long and unfinished. What waits inside Haven when he opens it alone? The building settled into a soft hush after the vote. Air moved slow, like a tide that forgot its force. Screens dimmed, and rain tapped a faint pattern above the lab. Mason Reed said, "Silence clears the smoke," and he let the quiet hold. Betrayal sat close, not loud, but heavy. He replayed each glance, each pause, and the 5-2 badge. Dana stood near the door, arms crossed, guarding his breath. Zoe traced the clean map again and again, as if heat might reveal ink. Evelyn watched the city, the glass a dull mirror that gave nothing back. Richard said, "Follow the smallest light." The tablet's key icon glowed like a star underwater. Mason Reed said, "We open haven for truth, not to hide." A second factor request waited, patient as stone. The token shimmered in a simple cup where no one had looked. The token's weight in his palm triggered an echo. The room thinned, and an older day unrolled. Mason Reed said, 2 years back, the storm quarter, and the hum matched a memory. Papers had smelled of toner and fear. Lyle had called with calm fire, offering runway and time. Evelyn had stayed late, sleeves rolled, eyes raw from fluorescent hum. Dana counted hours like beads. Zoe was new, but already seeing lines others miss. Noah fetched forms eager and quick. Richard warned that cheap time often costs more later. In the blend of then and now, the ledger tag first appeared small as dust. Evelyn Cross said, "We needed a vault for clean assets and whistle lines." The vault became Haven, and Haven took root. The memory faded to the lab's blue hush. A truth landed. The wall was built to save the core, not to steal. He asked for the room. The door latched, and the fans fell to a soft breath. Mason Reed said, "Tell me why the contract bears your name." Evelyn's gaze did not flinch. Pulse and screen glow set the rhythm. Dana's shadow moved behind the frosted glass, steady as a metronome. Richard waited at the hinge like a keeper. Zoe held the map near her chest. Evelyn Cross said, "We routed shell buyers as shields, not thieves." Each word landed like glass on cloth. Mason felt hurt slide under the truth. Noah's earlier path now read as bait, not remedy. The heartbeat in his ears eased. Mason Reed said, "Who knew the timing?" A pause, a single breath, a click from the rack. Evelyn said, "One person asked for mirror rights before dawn." The name formed without sound, and the purpose of Haven turned like a lock. The broadcast cut in again, as if summoned by the room's heat. Conrad's voice slid across the glass like oil. Conrad Vale said, "Leadership is truth measured in clean numbers, calm and bright." Mason Reed said, "You sell mirrors," and the words tasted bitter and real. Conrad listed virtues and wrapped them in gain. He spoke of rescue as if rescue were ownership by another name. Dana's jaw set. Zoe underlined the quiet note that fed his line. Richard murmured that perfect poise often hides a blade. Evelyn Cross said, "He wants us to trade our name for his breath." The choice sharpened. Conrad sounded righteous, but his map was made from stolen steps. Mason felt the floor of belief shift. If the enemy were a tie and a calm smile, then the fight was everywhere. Mason breathed in, slow, and let the truth settle its weight. Loss pressed in, but it did not crush. Mason Reed said, "Haven stands," and the room heard the line as a vow. Dana nodded, eyes bright, not soft. Zoe lifted the clean devices like tools, not charms. Richard's hand found his shoulder, light and sure. Evelyn Cross said, "Then we accept the heat and file it all." The cost arrived in images, hard headlines, colder quarters, long hours, steady spine. The fear did not leave. It changed shape. Mason Reed said, "We face it on our feet." Rain softened to a thin veil that let the city glow. Beyond the lab door, a red light marked the board floor. The night was not done. The next step was a blade, and he would take. Footsteps gathered in the board corridor like a drumline. The air cooled with recycled night. Lights buzzed and then steadied. Mason Reed said, "We walk in with the ledger open, and his breath tightened. Dana counted the speaking order under her breath. Zoe checked sync on the clean set, eyes fierce. Evelyn held the token like a seal. Richard listened for the tremor in the floor. The doors ahead breathed with quiet hydraulics. Conrad's voice leaked from within, smooth as glass. Lyle's name floated on a whisper. Mason Reed said, "No bluffs." The heartbeat of the building rose, then held. The handle cooled his palm. They pushed at once, and the room turned toward them. Chairs scraped. Cameras blinked. Conrad Vale said, "For stability, step aside." Each word clipped and bright. Mason Reed said, "For truth, stand with the facts." And he placed the Haven audit on the screen. Dana named the shell shields, not theft, not fraud. Zoe showed the node where the leak began. Evelyn Cross said, "I signed the structure to protect core assets and whistle routes." Richard added the dates and the blocked mirror at 5. Conrad smiled like a door that swings one way. He spoke of certainty, of market love. Mason Reed said, "You trade breath for names." The room split into lines of belief. The fight started in voices, not fists, but the cuts were deep. The blow landed where no one expected. A director announced a temporary suspension for Evelyn while the filing proceeded. The words felt like cold rain inside the room. Evelyn Cross said, "Do it clean," and placed the token on the table. Mason Reed said, "We need you," but he knew the cost had come due. Dana swallowed hard and kept her notes steady. Zoe's eyes burned, but her hands did not shake. Richard bowed his head, a brief prayer in breath. The hush rang louder than any alarm. The ledger on the screen did not blink. The price of truth stood in the center of the table, small and heavy. Conrad pressed his win. He moved with smooth hands and perfect tone. Conrad Vale said, "Leadership means surrender to what works." Mason Reed said, "Leadership means carrying the wound." Donna projected the full Haven map. Zoe overlaid the leak trail to a badge with mirror rights. Noah Grant's name surfaced like a shadow made of light. The room inhaled. Richard spoke the time, the door, the path. Noah stammered outside the frame, then fell silent. Mason Reed said, "Stand down." The contrast sharpened. Warm faces, cold screens, rain on glass like sparks. The decisive act began with a simple motion towards security. Silence returned like a tide after thunder. Security led Noah away. The room breathed again, ragged but alive. Mason Reed said, "File it all. No spin." Dana nodded and sent the package. Zoe closed the last window and leaned into the chair back, eyes wet. Richard stood straight, older and taller. Evelyn Cross said, "This was the truth all along from the hall," voice even. The light softened as the storm thinned. The city glowed like a bruise healing. Mason Reed said, "We stand even if we stand smaller." The image fixed in his mind. A token on wood, a ledger on glass, a door that stayed open. Dawn thinned the storm into pale light, and the building breathed again. Desks were still, screens asleep, air vents whispering like tide. Mason Reed stood by the glass and let silence name the cost. Dan Brooks stacked files with slow care, as if gentleness could mend edges. Zoe Carter rubbed a thumb across a coffee ring and stared through it. Richard Sterling watched the city yawn away. Evelyn Cross said, "We filed it," and her voice barely moved the air. The words settled like dust after a fall. Conrad Vale faded from the screens, but not from the room. The token lay between them, small and solemn. Mason Reed said, "We keep standing," yet he felt the missing weight beside him. He counted breaths and found one truth. Something dear had been traded so the company could live, and it would not return. In the small lounge, the hum was faint and steady. Mason Reed felt the ache behind his ribs and let it speak. He remembered the vote, the token on wood, the way Evelyn did not flinch. Dana Brooks said, "You did not break," and looked away to hide the tremor. Zoe Carter whispered, "We can rebuild clean," and traced a square in the air. Richard Sterling warmed his hands around a paper cup and said nothing. Images flashed like soft cuts. Noah led down a corridor. Conrad's still face. Headlines flattening into black bars. Mason Reed said, "Relief feels wrong." And the truth cut clean. Evelyn Cross said, "Wrong and right can share a room." And the room agreed. Outside, a bird tested the morning. Life was not the same. It moved anyway, slow and stubborn, and pulled them with it. In the empty war room, time slowed and circled. The screens held a frozen ledger like a shrine. Evelyn Cross stood in the doorway, haloed by weak light. She did not step in. Mason Reed said, "You knew the hurt and chose it," and the words ached. Evelyn's eyes softened, and a breath thinned the space between them. Dana Brooks adjusted a chair into line, small order after storm. Zoe Carter set a clean device on the table, careful and bright. Richard Sterling said, "Forgiveness is a tool, not a bow, letting it land." The hum curled into a quiet rhythm, like a slowed heart. Mason Reed said, "I am angry and grateful." Evelyn nodded once, carrying both. The room accepted the paradox, then exhaled. A door inside them closed and another opened. Richard brought an old memo, creased and thin. The paper smelled like boxes and years. He read 2 lines that once saved a different company and broke a few hearts. Richard Sterling said, "Guard the core, pay the debt, keep the name," and his voice carried old rain. Mason Reed heard the hinge in those words and felt something align. Dana Brooks smiled without teeth and steadied her breath. Zoe Carter said, "We keep the map simple," and marked 3 new guardrails. Evelyn Cross rested a palm on the memo like a pledge. The past and now braided in the quiet. Richard Sterling said, "You will lead lighter if you let weight be seen." Mason Reed felt the advice settle like warmth. A small grin cut through the gray, honest and tired, and stayed. By noon the filings posted, and the floor stilled into a new quiet. Mason Reed said, "No shadows," and opened the internal town hall. Dana Brooks read the covenant for clean practice. Zoe Carter showed the roadmap and did not oversell. Richard Sterling stood behind them, a steady spine. Evelyn Cross said, "I will transition after the reform is in place." And the air changed shape. The words did not wound, they weighed. Mason Reed felt sorrow move through him like tide, strong but not cruel. He said, "This is the price and the promise," and looked at the crew. The hum found a peaceful register. Outside, light warmed the wet streets. Their choice had cost them, and it had freed them. The path to Act 7 waited, clear and narrow, and they stepped toward it. Afternoon drifted into a held breath. The office moved softly like a city after snow. Mason Reed stood in the same glass corner and counted small sounds. Keys were fewer, voices lower, steps unhurried. He thought of the vote, the token, and the door that stayed open. Dana Brooks said, "We are still here," and the truth felt simple. Zoe Carter set a fresh checklist where the storm once lived. Richard Sterling traced a window streak and smiled at nothing. Evelyn Cross said, "Keep it clean," like a benediction. The silence did not accuse, it witnessed. Mason Reed said, "We learned how to stand," and let the words rest. He weighed loss against what remained and felt the scale stop moving. The question rose anyway. Was the cost the shape the truth needed to take? At the shred bin, old drafts met their end. Mason Reed fed one sheet, then another, and listened to the clean mechanical hum. Dana Brooks said, "Let it go," and the words were weightless. Zoe Carter walked a slow loop around the floor, checking lights and locks. Richard Sterling carried the creased memo to the archive with careful hands. Evelyn Cross closed a folder and slipped it into a box for later hands. Motion was quiet and sure. Mason Reed said, "We leave what we were and keep what we are," and felt the room agree. The last page slid in and became pulp. He turned toward the hall and saw a corridor made of days. The past did not vanish. It softened and held its place behind them. A recorded message waited in the shared drive. The file name was plain, almost shy. Richard Sterling pressed play, and the room filled with a younger voice. It spoke about guarding names by guarding people. Evelyn Cross said, "That was our start." And the quiet held it close. Dana Brooks closed her eyes and listened like prayer. Zoe Carter copied the line to the new standard. Mason Reed said, "We keep the door open for every hard truth," and felt the theme fit. The voice faded into a soft room tone, and the screens dimmed. The idea stayed bright. They stood in a circle around absence and called it direction. The company's promise did not sound loud. It sounded steady, and that was enough. Night settled gently over the floor. Cleaning carts whispered by like soft weather. Mason Reed walked the perimeter with slow steps. He saw teams in smaller knots, kinder in their movements. Dana Brooks offered a nod to a tired analyst and meant it. Zoe Carter showed a junior the clean route through a knot of numbers. Richard Sterling paused at the dark boardroom and let memory pass without ache. Evelyn Cross stood at the elevator and lifted a hand. Mason Reed said, "Thank you," and the word rang clear. The world did not cheer. It adjusted. That was its wisdom. He felt the company lean toward morning. In the boardroom, only the city and a single lamp glowed. The token rested on wood, and the ledger slept on glass. Mason Reed said, "Truth is not a crown," and the line felt right. He added, "It is a work we do," and the lamp hummed in assent. Dana Brooks closed the door behind them with care. Zoe Carter left the roadmap on the table, edges square. Richard Sterling looked at the skyline and saw a distance become near. Evelyn Cross pressed the elevator button and did not look back. Mason Reed touched the token and let it lie. He turned the lamp off and kept the window light. The room held one lasting echo. Truth must never be owned.